So inside the Lords this week, on the one hand, I've been relatively quiet and haven't spoken that much. I made a quick intervention on the strikes bill, which I'll come back to in a minute. But just so that you understand what's going on, there was quite a lot of media coverage about the fact that people from the Lords ended up staying till 4:25 in the morning discussing the migration bill, and the opposition benches, particularly the Lib Dem benches, have made great play of the fact that they're heroic and they stayed up scrutinising government's terrible bill on illegal migration. This then caused major controversy because it is undoubtedly the case that the government had forced them to stay long after the usual time of the Lords closing as a kind of punitive measure to force them to get through the amendments. And there was something of a kerfuffle about it. By the way, I didn't stay till 4:25 in the morning. I was actually speaking at the Free Speech Union's debate on giving people a voice in politics, which I think was probably more productive. But in terms of the illegal migration bill, I think there's two things to say about it. One is that when there was a big row the next day about why the government had forced this late sitting, it was raised by the government fairly reasonably that one of the problems is that at committee stage, the opposition benches basically drown any particular bill with so many amendments that you actually just get endless repetitious speeches. And there is openly an attempt at destroying the illegal migration bill by the opposition benches by making it untenable or impossible. It's a kind of filibustering technique. You basically gut it of any meaning. So to just use one example, it's Pride Month. So a number of peers who are associated with Stonewall Outlook put in, 10, 15 amendments saying that the bill needed to be amended to take into consideration the persecution of LGBT people and then they basically would have an amendment on a country and then followed by another country, followed by another country. You know, I mean, what? And apart from anything else, you think, well, why make those people who you say should be given a special exception to arrive in the UK? What about, Christians in a Muslim country or any number? I mean, it becomes the oppression Olympics, doesn't it? And regardless of what you think about refugee and asylum status, the difficulty is that if you were to say everybody who's suffered persecution around the world should be entitled to enter the UK on an asylum ticket, that's millions and millions and millions of people. So it obviously is more a way of annoying the government rather than holding a particular piece of legislation to proper scrutiny. Having said all of that, I also sat through some of the debate of the illegal migration bill, in which some people made some very good contributions about how the bill just doesn't work even at the government's own level. I would count that as good faith intervention, where they were basically pointing out that if you want to use it to do this, it's not worded correctly, it's illogical, it goes against the rule of law, and they've got a point there. But so much of this discussion is bad faith. Apparently at 2 in the morning, and I kind of read Hansard to find out, Lord Scriven of the Lib Dems basically accused the government of creating this bill as, wait for it, red meat for the red wall. I just want you to consider that phrase. Red meat for the red wall implies that people who live in red wall constituencies, as they're known, are like beasts who you can throw some red meat to, kind of savages who all they have to be done is thrown. I mean, it's so disgusting. And I draw your attention to that because the same Lib Dem benches are the ones who, every time they speak, and they speak at great length opposing this bill, stand up and say the atrocious thing about the debate on the small boats is the kind of language that's used to demonise asylum seekers. And they say, the invasion, they always report on that. They say that this is divisive language and rhetoric, and yet they are allowed to stand up and say that a piece of legislation is red meat for the red wall, and they get a lot of hears in the chamber. So, I think that tells you a lot. But it does make me reflect on the fact that I sometimes get in impossible situations. I don't think that the illegal migration bill tackles the issue of small boats. I think that if you read the bill, it really is all over the place. And I do think that it doesn't allow any kind of a rational, sensible conversation on the issue of asylum, migration, you know, grown-up conversation that might require you having some difficult conversations. But the problem is that because it's being attacked in bad faith by people who just refuse to acknowledge that there is an issue at all in relation to migration, you end up partly defending the government, which I don't really want to do, because that's not really what I believe. So I've tried to keep out of it as much as possible and not particularly, you know, I've spoken once on the use of international treaties being used to stop democratic decision making, and that's appropriate, but following it through closely beyond that, it's almost impossible. And I think that I'm hoping anyway that we can have that conversation beyond Parliament, because I just think the issue of migration is just being messed up at the moment by the polarising and irrational way that it's being discussed in terms of lawmaking. I also just want to reflect on the strikes bill, because I know that a lot of people feel very fed up with the way that strikes are being used to, as we speak, disrupt people's lives, and people get fed up, and the government then just do a headline and say we're bringing in this bill that requires minimum services. But actually it's involved in ping pong, i.e. it's gone from the Lords to the Commons, it's come back from the Commons, refusing the Lords amendments, come back, and there was a debate. And I actually spoke very briefly, but also voted with the opposition on this one, because the government are in a situation whereby they are deflecting from the state of public services and public utilities by saying that the reason why the service provision is so poor is because of strikes. And anyone who knows anything about what's happening with everything from cancer delays for diagnosis, not being able to see your GP, not being able to get a train on time, all of the things that are falling apart, the idea that that is created by strikes is so self-evidently a nonsense. But the government genuinely are doing something really dangerous, which is to say that they are demanding and forcing employers to tell trade unions, well, you might have legally voted for a strike, legally based on legislation brought in by this very Tory government, but now we're going to say that you need to stipulate named people who voted for strike that they must come in and provide a minimum service. And that means that you're basically denying people the right to strike. You are coercing them to work when they voted against working. It goes against freedom. And the minister had the temerity to say, I'm not worried about this because I'm prepared to trust the discretion of employers, which basically means he's never worked for a boss in his life, or certainly not a boss that he's ever had to go on strike against, which I suspect is true. I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that we've got to be very careful about the way that we treat trade unions. You know, a number of things have happened recently, which means that I support the right to strike. It doesn't mean I support, for example, the union, the University College Union, when it's thrown every gender-critical academic under the bus, or when they pass ridiculous motions about Ukraine, or when the leaders of the UCU refused to acknowledge that students deserved face-to-face teaching during lockdown and actually argued the opposite. All of these things we should be critical of. But it's equally ridiculous for the Tories to just have a kind of blanket trade unions or troublemakers position. Because interestingly enough, during this week, something happened, which was the leader of the GMB actually came out with a statement criticising the Labour Party, said it hopes Labour gets elected, but drawing attention to the fact that Labour's net zero policy, energy policy, which means stopping drilling for oil and gas, is ridiculous and it's not going to work. And I thought it was a great intervention, because they actually talked about working class jobs. And they actually talked about the needs of, that we have for a cheap and efficient energy, and that you needed a wide range of energy sources, not just to go down the green energy, sustainable energy route. And in that instance, the government would have been as well to have embraced the leader of the GMB, said how brilliant a trade union like the GMB's saying something we agree with, but of course they can't because they've got this stupid anti-union bill which isn't solving anything and is entirely unnecessary because there's absolutely sufficient within the legislation as it is to have a minimum service during strikes. So that's kind of my rant on that. I'm quite, at the moment, pessimistic about the state of political parties, it has to be said, and looking at them going through the motions is not an edifying situation. But I do think it's important that we nonetheless hold people to account. I'm glad that my colleague Rob Lyons is going to write a Substack actually on the whole green energy issue, the nonsense associated with net zero and recycling, because I think that we have to take the very specific policies and really critique them whichever side they're coming from. And finally, the outcome of all of this is that politics has to be rebuilt from a grassroots level, because I just think that the more I sit in that chamber and listen to people, the more I realise how divorced they are from the real lives of ordinary people, the real rows that are going on, the discussions, the difficult discussions, and that can be on everything from, you know, trans rights to trans rights and row about trans rights and gender and sex and so on, through to discussions about whether how we cope with the cost of living crisis and whether workers are the ones who should be forced to pay for the mess that's been made of the economy. And so, as always, I want to recommend that you get your cheap ticket to the Battle of Ideas Festival, not till the end of October, so there's an advert below. But also because my colleagues have been organising a series of debates around debating matters for sixth formers, 16 to 18 year old, they're all just back from doing a special championship at the Durham Union. And as they all said, the discussions which were on things like strikes in the NHS, on issues like cancel culture, on issues like surrogacy, were richer and showed more depth and more understanding, or at least difficult, and were tackled in good faith by 16 to 18 year olds because they'd done their research, they'd really thought about it, and that's the way that you need to make a political reality come alive, which is to take young people and every generation seriously and ensure that these debates are had out in the public sphere. So you'll be hearing more about that shortly. The other thing is just to encourage you to get people to sign up to our Substack. This Substack is free, but it's just a place where we throw and put together all of our material. We have guest writers such as Stuart Waiton from the Scottish group who are organising around education during the week, a brilliant article on teaching of sex education. My highlight of the week, by the way, was bumping into Kishwa Faulkner, who is Baroness Faulkner, who runs the HRC, who had suffered the most horrible degree of bullying and around the fact that she was trying to clarify the law on sex, biological sex, gender and protected characteristics. And I'm afraid the staff at the EHRC had kind of put in a huge dossier complaining about her, saying she was transphobic and so on and so forth. So she had a really horrible time. Luckily it got in the press. A big group of us in the Lords signed the petition. I mentioned this in the last Substack. It was really nice to go up to her and give her a hug, have a chat with her, make sure she was all right, because she really went through the grind on it, and she said it was horrible, but she told a story that just illustrates what problems we got in politics. She's been inundated with people phoning her up saying, we absolutely agree with you, I run a board of this museum or of that university or of this, and it's terrible out there, isn't it? So, you know, off the record, I support you. Nothing more chilling than off the record. The problem is that we need more people to be like Kishwa Faulkner, which is to go on the record in taking these issues forward, not people in places of authority, secret squirreling away, being giving you solidarity. So a call to courage for everyone. But it was really nice to see her, and she did point out that so many grassroots groups had sent her flowers and chocolates and shown solidarity, which shows you that the solidarity is likely to come from outside Parliament rather than from within.